Oy. So I read 3 books by Andy Weir, watched 2 movies based on his work, and I have thoughts. Hi, my name is Jakub, and for some reason I like poking bears. And again, I have a feeling that this is one of those days where I'm about to poke one, because I think I'm about to science the shit out of a guy who's made a career out of writing about people who science the shit out of things, who is Andy Weir. And that's because the more I read this guy's work, the more I realize, and I think at this point, I think I've earned the right to kind of, just have, I think I have enough of a perspective on the guy's work that he's not really writing different characters. He's writing the same sort of way of thinking, and he just dresses it differently, but he's doing the same shtick all over and over again. But before we go any deeper into this, check out my website, flashonfilm.com. Check out my podcast, Uncut Gems Podcast, where respectively I write about films and I talk about films. And also, actually feel free to check out the previous video I made on the subject, because I just, a few days ago, I recorded a little video where I talked about Project Hail Mary. And actually, while recording that rant, I've sort of halfway through made a promise to myself that I would kind of just go deeper into this, which is what I'm doing now. So go and do that, and as usual, do all the things: follow, like, share, subscribe, and if you disagree or agree with what I have to say, leave a comment below. And hope you have fun. And actually, another disclaimer, because because I have a feeling like this is a kind of one of those subjects, and actually even like Variety and the Hollywood Reporter, you kind of start seeing articles saying like Project Hail Mary and Andy Weir generating weird debates online. I mean, like, sure, yeah, but just bear in mind, this is not rage bait. I'm not here to antagonize people on purpose. This is something that I put some thought into. Actually, I put a lot of thought into this, and I'm not here to like make anyone angry. I'm here to offer a perspective. You may agree or disagree with it, but this is not out of malice. This is out of genuine curiosity, and just because I feel like, I don't know, sometimes I notice patterns in life, and I have a, like a compulsion to express it, either through writing about it or talking to a phone camera. so anyway, so let's get into this. So, oh wow, right. So Andy Weir, for those who don't know, and if you don't know, what are you doing here? But okay. But if you don't know, Andy Weir is kind of one of the most popular sci-fi authors currently operating, right? Like, he's written I think his first novel, I think he published as a sort of like a web novel. I don't know if he did it in installments or on his blog. It was called The Egg, I think. But he's mainly known for The Martian and Project Hail Mary. And there's the third one kind of wedged in between the two. By the way, I might as well just mention, like, The Martian, he wrote first. He published it first in 2011, and then it was republished as like in a standard sort of way in 2014. Then he followed it up with Artemis in 2017, and then with Project Hail Mary in 2021. 2 of his books were adapted into films, The Martian and Project Hail Mary, and actually the latter one of which is kind of the reason why I'm here kind of talking to a camera. And that's because I kind of have thoughts on this. You have to forgive me, because like I'm kind of freestyling this a little bit, but anyway. Like, if you read one of his books, I think I read one of his books, and I think I started with The Martian like years and years ago, and really loved it, and then progressively I started noticing things that kind of started worrying me, because I kind of couldn't get into any of his other books. And now, having spent some time thinking about it, this is kind of where I arrived. Okay, so this is why I'm here. It's not that his books are bad, and actually, like, just as a total tangent, because like I finished reading Project Hail Mary like almost on the way to the cinema. Like, I was finishing the last chapter while walking, just looking at my Kindle, which is not the safest thing to do. Kids don't do it at home or on the street. Even though I didn't vibe with this book, and maybe this is also a topic for a completely separate, just freestyle rant at some point in the future. Like, I sat down next to a guy in the cinema watching something else completely. I think we were watching the They Will Kill You, and we were talking about Project Hail Mary, because, like, I don't know, we struck up a conversation while the trailers are playing, and the guy's like, oh, I didn't read the book. I said to him, like, even though I didn't like the book, but he says, like, oh, like I need to get back into reading. And I said, like, you know what, actually read this book because it's easy to get into, right? It's kind of, even though I didn't like it, I can see how, if this is something that you're about to pick up after, like, I don't know, a 10-year long hiatus from reading, it's probably an easy kind of gateway drug, because there's many reasons for it, because for all its problems, Andy Weir kind of writes very accessible fiction. So I want to get this out of the way. This is the throat clearing part of this whole, whatever this is. It's just what I have with I have like a whole bunch of problems with his writing, but I think just in general, when I started looking more holistically about the guy's work, I started kind of noticing that he essentially writes the same character multiple times, dresses them in different clothes, gives them different jobs, and kind of opts for very simple dramatic sort of structures and frameworks, because all he's really interested in is problem solving, right? His books are about how everything in the world can be reduced to solvable problem systems where you can apply logic and some kind of competence to save the day. Or so it would seem, right? Well, superficially, like The Martian works, Project Hail Mary works, and like people love these books because there's a good reason for it. There's some kind of like an accessibility to how he writes about solving problems, and this is something I touched on in the previous video. There's an idea that he has about, I don't know, reducing a very complex problem of, I don't know, collecting a sample of biological material while orbiting a planet at some kind of a velocity and whatever, and he has his characters invent a solution because they have a problem they need to solve. So the solution they have to find using the means they have. And he manufactures drama out of getting you to sit on the shoulder of someone who's good at their job and good at what they're doing, very competent, and look at them solve problems. Right, and he does it in such an accessible way that you can almost trick yourself into thinking that this is so simple that you could do it too, even though you couldn't, because the characters are always like 1 or 2 steps ahead of you, right? But that's kind of like the allure, the idea of just getting people to think that they're a little bit smarter, and this is genuinely a good idea to have. Like, you don't really want to separate yourself from your readers by openly just drawing a line and saying, like, I'm smarter than you peasants. So this is something that's actually just, like, it's laudable in many ways. But what I have a problem with is that there's friction in here. There's some kind of a weird friction between the logic of adhering to hardcore realism of scientific problem solving and extreme fantasy of building characters capable of doing that. Okay? The whole argument is that in Andy Weir's worlds, his characters are kind of written in such a way that everything is essentially solvable and therefore simple, explainable, solvable, reducible, and therefore eventually easy to figure out, right? So imagine in The Martian, Mark Watney gets stranded on Mars and he gets like left behind by his mission, who then have to go swing back around the Earth and whatever, and go and collect him. But he has to survive on the planet in an inhospitable environment, and he has to figure out how to do this. This is where the let's science the shit out of things kind of comes from, because he just looks at his predicament, he looks at his surrounding, and instead of wallowing in despair, he goes like, right, okay, how do I stay alive? And because all Weir's books are written in this sort of first person, sort of limited view. So we don't know what the world around the characters is about. We're kind of sitting in one of the characters' heads at all times. But what happens is and on top of this, actually, this is an important distinction, that it's not even that it's a first-person narration, it's a first-person self-aware narration where the character frequently addresses the reader, or like in a movie concept, he would be turning to the camera and addressing you specifically, to breaking the fourth wall, right? So in The Martian, the guy goes like, okay, well, how do I stay alive? How do I manufacture my own shot at leaving this planet? How do I communicate with Earth? And essentially just tries to apply cold-hearted logic, like a scientific method, to break a very complex, very sort of intimidating, complex problem into smaller and smaller problems that eventually become small enough that you can solve them one by one. And then you just arrange them in sequence, and you get and you get a sort of like a logical progression of what the character needs to do to achieve A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and eventually, I don't know, get to safety with a few caveats. And like something is going to go wrong. Solving one problem is going to cause another one to occur. But the whole idea is just, in all of his 3 books that I've read at least, is everything's kind of reduced to strings of small problems that the character gets to solve using wit, their intelligence, and expertise. So he's not necessarily exploring complexity. He's almost attempting to remove it, right? And that's, in one way, like if you read one of his books, that's actually extremely appealing. And then when you start looking at, okay, well, this is, like he's doing it at all, like every single time he writes a book, it's all about that kind of drama of, here's a complex problem. Oh my goodness, we need to save the world. I don't know, we need to leave the planet. We need to, I don't know, stay alive because there's a conspiracy on the moon, and I'm somehow involved in it. But he's essentially removing complexity by reducing these sort of massive problems into small ones, right? And that's not bad per se, but it illustrates one thing, because, and this is where another part of friction kind of comes into play, because he writes characters who like pass themselves as competent experts in their fields. Like Mark Watney is an engineer and a botanist, which already becomes like, it's like, why would you be both a botanist and an engineer, right? Or in Project Hail Mary, Ryland Grace is I think it's a molecular biologist or a microbiologist. At this point, I don't remember. And I'm too lazy to check, even though I have internet right in front of me. In Artemis, like we are following a smuggler who has this sort of like a weird street smarts about her, and she has this sort of like a puzzle solving, problem solving knack, and actually a little bit more resilience baked into her sort of character. But what he's suggesting, that all these people, on top of being masters at multiple domains, they also have like these extra expertise baked into them just for no reason, or because, like, well, since you're an engineer, so you might as well just be good at quantum physics, hardcore maths, chemistry, biology. Like he's, like Mark Watney is making, he's making ammonia out of hydrazine, I think, if I remember correctly in the book, by passing it over an iridium catalyst. And this is something that he's just reducing to a simple problem, even though he's not a chemist, he's not a trained scientist in this sort of space, but he acts confidently enough to make you aware that it's like, oh, he's an engineer, so therefore he probably must be an expert at everything, right? And this is where I do have a problem, because all of these sort of characters that he writes, and let's focus on main characters first, right? The secondary characters will come later, are essentially proxies for something else. They're not reflecting reality. Like, even though the problems they're solving reflect reality, the characters are completely fantastical. Like, they're fantastical. Like, people like this just don't exist. Okay? There are people who think they could get to be that level who do exist, and this is kind of where I think we kind of get to the crux of the problem, because if you ever spoke to any scientists who are actually just masters in their domain, these are the least confident people you'd ever imagine experiencing, but outside of their domain. They're extremely confident in their domain, even with that sort of the caveat of they also know how much they still have to learn within their domain. So people, like really smart people who have like strings of publications behind their belts, they are extremely humble at the same time most of the time. They know what they know, but they also know what they don't know, and they know and they know that they have, and they have this sort of the requisite curiosity and the humility to ask questions and put themselves in a vulnerable position of being wrong, right? On the other hand, people who actually, like, and this is from my personal experience, so if you disagree, again, leave a comment, right? But from my experience, people who exude that kind of confidence, you tend to be more on the junior side, tend to be students, tend to be, and not engineers, but engineering majors. They could be, and more specifically, I would probably even say, they would be like people you'd meet in like student halls who also like happen to be like third year computer science majors, specifically computer science or software engineering majors. And this dovetails into Andy Weir's own sort of background, because he's, by trade, he's a computer engineer, he's a software engineer, he's a computer programmer. This is his ballpark. This is what he knows, right? So, and again, like, even though he writes these sort of science fiction sort of epics set in worlds that are beyond our own, he still applies the same logic of like, write what you know, because like you write characters that you have experience, you have interacted with. So what he writes is not botanist meets engineer, is guys who he's may have interacted with. And this is, I'm not trying to character assassinate Andy Weir in here. Like, I'm trying to make sense of where this potentially comes from, and why. Because what happens, in my experience at least, is when you speak to software engineers who may be on the junior side, so actually they haven't really lived long enough to actually just realize that actually I'm not really like the smartest person around, because they do have that sort of cockiness about them, right? But because what gives them that confidence is that what they essentially train in is problem solving and communication. These are the two things that sort of a computer scientist or a software engineer needs to be really great at, is to be able to break complex problems down into simple steps that they can program for. And they also have to be able to communicate sort of, I don't know, the language of science that they have to break down into the language of computer programming. So that's kind of the two domains that they're really good at. Call it the hard scientists in these sort of like classical fields like physics, maths, and science, and and chemistry and biology. They still have to have the problem solving ability, and the communication ability is just different, right? Because on top of that, they also have to just get the sort of the body of subject matter expertise somehow to fit into their brains, right? They have to just learn a lot of theory and practice in the field that they have to operate within, right? Meanwhile, computer programmers, whenever they have a problem they need to solve, be it in physics, they'll just acquire whatever they need, write a program, or I don't know, build a project, whatever. And sort of the byproduct of that is, if you're not careful, you might actually start thinking that, like, quantum physics is easy because I've just written like this massive program together with a bunch of friends, and it's not that hard. Like, it's just a bunch of smaller problems that you get to code for. This is kind of like the Dunning-Kruger sort of danger that you may find yourself in, because if you start thinking like that, then you realize, then you actually may just waltz yourself into a position that you think you're smarter than you are. And this is kind of like, and this actually illustrates what the characters that Andy Weir writes are like. They're not scientists, they're not engineers. They're very confident people who think they know everything because they believe in sort of like transference of expertise. They have a programmer brain, if that makes any sense. And as a result of that, they think they can transfer. Okay, well, I'm already good at botany, therefore, if I apply, if problem X looks like problem X prime in botany, then I can apply the logic I found in botany and use it here. It may or may not work, and when it does, they get the confidence of thinking like, actually, I'm good at engineering or whatever else at the domain to which I've applied rules from my own domain of expertise. Therefore, I'm smart in both domains. This is something I heard like weeks ago. There are worse things, but there's nothing worse than someone who's accidentally proven right twice. If someone just guesses once, and they, I don't know, predicts the stock market, just buys, I don't know, shorts the Nvidia stock at the right time, and just win, and it just earns like $3,000, right? They'll think like, it's nice, but do it twice in a row. They will actually, like, some people, a subset of people who do that will actually start thinking that they have magical powers, or they have like weird competence of predictive powers, and they should commit some more time and energy to trading or something like that, right? Weir kind of applies that sort of logic, that this sort of the competence is transferable between fields, and it probably is, but only to a point, because the scientific method kind of just governs all fields to an extent, but it's also heavily caveated on a field by field basis by just experience, data, and just quirks in reasoning that are just supremely specific to certain fields that are just not transferable, you know. So as a result, what you kind of get in like looking at characters that Andy Weir writes, which is, be it like Ryland Grace in Project Hail Mary or Mark Watney or whatever, that they look intelligent, but this is an illusion. This is an illusion of intelligence. And first of all, you get to see how in real time they break down just inaccessible problems into small logical steps that you, as a reader, you get to follow. And then as they explain in a very rudimentary fashion, how they operate, you will think like, oh, this is actually easy. And this is something like coming from my sort of field of chemistry, where I have trained for years and years, right? But when I read in Project Hail Mary, for instance, like, oh, how do you make sulfur dioxide? Because in the book they figure out they need to approximate, I don't know, I can't remember, like the atmosphere of Venus, and there's like 5% of sulfur dioxide, and they have to find it somewhere, and there's no Deus ex machina to give them a little cylinder of sulfur dioxide on the ship. So he goes like, oh, you just take sulfuric acid and pass it over some copper. I'm like, in principle, yes, that's how it works. But if I just gave you this information and asked you to make some sulfur dioxide, you'd either fail or hurt yourself, or both. Probably both, right? Because there are nuances to certain things. There's theory and there's practice. There's experiment and there's the thinking about what in theory happens on the sort of molecular level or atomic level, right? When Mark Watney is making ammonia by just getting an iridium catalyst and passing some hydrogen over top of it, like, I'm surprised that he didn't die, because what happens is Weir kind of reduces these complex problems into very small solvable chunks, while completely removing reality of science, because what he knows is the sort of the computer programmer sort of science of, if it's simple enough to be coded for with simple logic, therefore it's solvable. And because if a person is good at field A that's governed by the same rules, then they should in theory be good at the field B if the same rules apply. And that's kind of and that's kind of how you get the illusion of competence. And with that, the competence and intelligence becomes a fantasy, because you realize that one person can actually fix everything, and like unicorns like this don't, like Buckaroo Banzai, like these characters, like, they don't exist. They're fantastical, right? They're unicorns for a reason, right? And at this point, someone's gonna raise their hands like, but this is just a novel. This is fiction. Can you just get on board with this? Sure. Yes, in theory. And actually, I will probably say, like, in a caveat, when I read The Martian and then I watched The Martian, I got on board with this because there's a fantasy element baked into this, and the problems start sort of surfacing when you realize that this, across all these books, like, he writes the same character 3 times over, right? And this is a problem, because at this point I'm just like, I don't know what to do with it, right? He writes essentially, and as I said, there's friction with it, because he writes essentially an extremely realistic sort of scenario with these problems that are rooted in extreme realism. He pays extreme attention. I use extreme a lot in a sentence, but he pays extreme attention to detail of whether the orbital mechanics are right, whether the chemistry makes sense, the biology makes sense. Everything has to make sense. Like, as I said in the previous video, like, it has to pass the sort of like Neil deGrasse Tyson sniff test, it has to make fundamental sense, so you wouldn't be able to say like, well, actually this isn't the wrong orbit, or actually this doesn't work. Actually, when you think about it, like, as a chemist, I can say well, actually a couple of times, because he breaks these complex sort of chemical problems down almost too much, right? It's not that simple. Almost as it's not that simple to perform microbiological experiments in zero gravity or whatever. Like, there's more nuance to this. You can't just do certain things and magic things away. But there's friction, because on one hand, you're building these extremely realistic scenarios, and they're dropping an extremely fantastical unicorn character in the middle of them to solve them, right? And once is okay. Twice it's like, okay, but 3 times it looks like a pattern. And at this point, you might as well just go and ask, like, well, hey, isn't that what authors do? They will write a character who's just essentially like Jack Reacher. Isn't it like a guy who just can do everything? Sure, yes, same character. same character, and actually there's some allure in this. Like, what is Jack Reacher going to do? Like, at this point, I would have actually liked for Mark Watney to be put in like these 3 books. Like, I want him to be this unicorn guy who just gets dropped in these 3 scenarios, and he just has to figure shit out himself. Okay, it would have been more believable because I could understand this as like a fantasy series based, like, layered on top of realistic hard science fiction background. Okay, but he isn't. It's just all he. I think this is just all he knows, right? Here's another example. Dan Brown. I actually didn't. If I have to be perfectly honest, like, Andy Weir kind of functions kind of somewhere between Lee Child, Dan Brown, and kind of Michael Crichton, kind of just lurking in the background. Dan Brown has the same sort of shtick or similar shtick because he wrote the character of Robert Langdon, who's a symbologist, right? A guy who's just good at interpreting symbols, right? But what Dan Brown does most of the time is he doesn't really leave them alone. He's not like an all singing, all dancing polymath. He's good at something. He has his domain expertise is this, symbology or whatever this is, in some archaeology, some history, whatever, art history, whatnot, right? But he's always paired with a different expert in a different domain who would be helping them solve these riddles, right? Because like actually, like Andy Weir is kind of like weirdly structurally basing his work around Dan Brown, maybe even accidentally, I don't know. Langdon gets summoned to, I don't know, just figure out what these symbols mean because they found, I don't know, like a dead body in the Louvre, and he gets paired with a cryptologist who's good at riddles, right? And he's and then she's also like good at other things. She's a police officer and has other skills, but these are 2 people with different domains working together, collaborating, okay? And it just populates across different books. In Inferno and The Lost Symbol and Angels and Demons, like there's always a situation where Langdon's going to get paired with someone else, maybe with multiple people, so they together would apply their domain expertise to solve complex problems. And that reflects reality much more, even though the problems that they describe are completely divorced from it. That's a different kind of fiction, but the reality of problem solving is actually much more sort of true to life than this. What Andy Weir writes, because he writes characters, I think, like, I don't want to be reductive, but I think, like, if I wanted to be mean, you could kind of say like the characters he writes are the sort of like dumb person's idea what a smart person looks like. These are the scientists of the kind that you'd find on The Big Bang Theory. And maybe in The Martian, sort of the closest proxy for that would be the people who work at the JPL lab. There's no such thing as JPL lab. There's just JPL because the L in JPL stands for lab. But the engineers who work there, they kind of look like Howard Wolowitz, you know, and they sound like him too, okay? While like Dan Brown kind of pairs these people together and have them solve problems, like Andy Weir just writes one person who's sort of like, I don't know, entire character archetype is based on what if a computer programmer could actually transfer their expertise across different domains and just become a superhuman polymath who's a problem-solving Superman, right, or Superwoman. And even with that, I would probably say there's a separate, because like the character the protagonist in Artemis is a woman, and that's even a problem as well because she does not sound like a woman at all. And I'm gonna get to this in a second, but what you get as a result of this is this main character syndrome that every character in the sort of main character in these books, they actually think they're the most important in the world because they have this sort of magical skill of being able to solve everything, right? Like a science high school teacher somehow through a set of weird coincidences finds themselves as one of the head scientists on an international project aiming to save the planet. Wouldn't happen, right? So in the realities that we're otherwise built, which is reliant on hardcore science, like the logic of human interactions and politics is just completely divorced from it as well. But yeah, so Dan Brown would pair people together to solve problems. Andy Weir just thinks like, no, one person is enough. Like I'm good enough as it is. Meanwhile, Michael Crichton just offers even a different wrinkle, right? So his characters would never be good at everything. They will actually just competence is completely diffused and distributed, and actually everyone in these sort of spaces is either aware or made aware of their shortcomings, because Crichton this was kind of his trick too, that he would write about systems that fail. He would write about conspiracies that don't work, systems that fail, dreams that don't really pan out, and these books would be kind of about the sort of how science is flawed because of its confidence. So what you have is, like in Project Hail Mary, essentially just you get a guy whose actions will have ramifications on the entire world. Meanwhile, like in Michael Crichton, the entire systems are built out of smaller individuals who then get overwhelmed, which is a little bit more interesting. In Dan Brown, you'll have multiple people working towards a similar problem. And I suppose like this is where what I'm probably just gearing out to say is Andy Weir is kind of closer to Lee Child than he is to Dan Brown or Michael Crichton, but they operate in the same sort of plane of genre, sort of like understanding of writing, right? In addition, Weir's characters, and this is something that actually does irk me, are kind of sort of weirdly flawless because they are confident they can do everything. We don't ever get to spend enough time with them, like as people, because all they're ensconced in is solving problems, that we don't even get to meet them or see them as people. They're just problem-solving machines. So who are like almost immune to stress or immune to panic. They don't spiral. They don't contradict themselves. They're perfect, right? And even with that, like you have, and as a result, like the arcs that we are built for them are extremely clean. They're very simple, right? So what he does is like Grace kind of transitions from a coward to a hero without much ado. And actually, at the same time, I'll probably say he's doing it in response to working with another character, a space alien spider, right? Who's essentially kind of like him as well. He's also like an engineer who's good at solving everything. This is the first time I think where Andy Weir kind of just behaves a little bit like Dan Brown, because he gives him a sidekick who's like, okay, well, he's an engineer, but then again, like Ryland Grace is still correcting his homework, which kind of just leads me to sort of like another one of my pet peeves, and this is something that's actually probably the most important of all of them, and that's broken down into two. Andy Weir essentially ventriloquizes his characters, and this is something that has been picked up on by critics, I think, on the occasion of Artemis, because like when he wrote a female character, sort of protagonist, she sounded like Mark Watney, and it's just like, well, why does she sound like Mark Watney? She's a woman. She should have her own character, but she still sounds like Mark Watney. Like, yeah, sure, she does. She also sounds like Ryland Grace. She actually sounds like a bunch of other characters in his books, because they all sound like what I believe is just what Andy Weir's inner voice sounds like. That's him that you're experiencing. So you're not spending any time with any characters in here. You're not spending time with Mark Watney or like, I don't know, Jazz or Grace or even Rocky. You're spending time with Andy Weir, because even like the space spider is essentially ventriloquized by the author. He sounds and behaves and has the same sort of like moral sort of backbone, just exactly built in the same way as everybody else in his books. And this is a genuine piece of criticism, as in like, hey, hey dude, when you write another book, can you please pay attention to more character development so that they will actually sound and feel different than all the previous ones? Or if you don't want to, just can you please write a book where Ryland Grace is just saving the world elsewhere? They don't even have to logically make sense. That actually would be more fun if like Mark Watney would be just the same character dropped into different scenarios, but there's no continuity between these things. It's just, I'm just writing the same character in like a myriad different scenarios that have no logical sort of connection to one another. 1 year is in the moon, one year is on Mars, and somewhere else is on like Tau Ceti or whatever. That would make more sense to me. But now we have to have different characters that all sound the same, and these are main characters. When it comes to secondary characters, like Weir kind of goes for either of the two. Either they all still sound like Mark Watney, Ryland Grace, or which is essentially a proxy for Andy Weir ventriloquizing all of them and puppeteering them. Or they're kind of like what I call them, like Michael Bay sort of broad stereotypes. And like when you think of like a Michael Bay movie, you have two types of women, where it's either like a hottie just like covered in grease working on a Dodge Camaro, or a fat woman eating a sandwich. There's no in between. The same goes for like cars, like in a Michael Bay film, and you either have supercars or pickup trucks. There's no in between, right? Sorry, the third type will be military vehicles, right? But you kind of get the gist that when it comes to Andy Weir's supporting characters, it's either smaller characters that are equally ventriloquized. So there's a few sort of bigger supporting characters in both The Martian and Project Hail Mary, And there's the smaller one, even smaller ones, which are essentially just stencils defined either by their job or by their nationality. Like a Russian character has to have a drinking problem. Like a French character has to, like, almost sounds like they have a ho 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 going about them. Like you almost imagine that they probably wear a beret unironically, right? And that's a problem because it kind of looks like, why is that? Oh, that's probably because Andy Weir just does not care about his characters at all. They're all puppets for him, so he's puppeteering them and saying, like, we're gonna solve problems today, and that's all he cares about, okay? Because at the end of the day, all his books are written in a way that's just, let's build either a conspiracy like an Artemis or a scenario where someone's stranded on an inhospitable planet and has to figure out how to find their way home, or someone wakes up with amnesia in the middle of deep space and has to figure out what the hell's going on, right? And actually the third one, but just sounds like such a cliche. This is like a writing sort of workshop cliche prompt of write a story that starts with someone waking up in a hospital bed, not remembering how they got there, and go from there. Like, it sounds like such a cliche, right? But all he cares about is just the complexity of problem solving. Meanwhile, everything else is reduced to cliches because he doesn't have time, inclination, or energy to give them like 5 minutes thought. That's kind of how you get these sort of broad stereotypes populating the background of his stories when they are there at all, right? While unicorn superhuman scientists with cross-domain expertise essentially save the world or I don't know, the universe. And that's kind of how I have these real problems, right? Because like I don't find, like, when you actually see it, or when I saw it, I stopped really just deriving any pleasure out of this, because I realized, like, oh no, like this, like at this point I'm not looking forward to another book of this guy, because I have a feeling that this is going to be more of the same. I'll still probably give it a shot, and then I'll just end up disappointed, and I'll end up with the same thoughts, and then I'll just do it again and again because I have this weird hope in humanity that maybe at some point he's going to learn the lesson and actually write a character that's different. But that's besides the point. But at the same time, while I have a problem with this, clearly everybody else doesn't. And that's another sort of like an interesting wrinkle for my money, at least, because it tells me that, you know, like, it has incredible audience or readership appeal, right? Because tinfoil hat, it kind of does appeal, like, this sort of idea of the transference of competence. It appeals to this sort of like the online native Reddit sort of experts who are, you know, like, have, I don't know, some domain, like, kind of like Ryland Grace is a Reddit expert because he's a, I don't know, molecular biologist or a high school teacher who's also like, whose hobby is astronomy. So he just knows certain things, but, you know, like, he knows certain things that, like, I don't know, people who have spent time learning physics would, right? So even that's a little bit sketch. Like, you know, Boltzmann distributions, just like people on, you know, like, who haven't spent time actually hard reading and learning about this wouldn't have first clue what the hell it's talking about. Like, the idea that, you know, like, if you heat a body to a certain temperature, at different temperatures, different wavelengths of light are emitted by a glowing body, you know, by a heated body, right? This kind of appeals to that kind of like audience of people for whom this competence fantasy is their own personal fantasy of, like, you know, what if it could be me? Maybe I could transfer my competence from one field to another and solve a riddle like this and become a hero. You know, maybe this is like a vicarious wish fulfillment, right? So it's not an appeal. So it's not an insult, by the way. Just before you stand up, but it does. But this is kind of how it appeals to some sections of the audience. But I think what appeals most to the general audience is the idea that everything kind of just, you feel like you're in safe hands. That's first and foremost, like on character level. You feel like you're in safe hands because these problems are just broken down into very simple steps, and they're draped over very accessible, easy to digest, dramatic constructs. They're all, and this is probably the biggest sort of piece of appeal this guy has, that his stories, all told, even with my pet peeves kind of baked into them, they're extremely accessible. They're like blockbuster movies written down in book format, right? And that's how they're so easily transferable to a movie setting, with the caveat of, like, if you make all of his books into movies, they will all look the same because of Andy Weir's sort of proclivity to ventriloquize his characters and write all of these characters in the same way. But nonetheless, these books would make incredibly cinematic movies. And as you read them, the experience of reading them is also appropriately entertaining. Like it's hands in the air. Project Hail Mary is the easiest 500 pages you'll get through. Okay, that's just what I'm gonna say. Like the Martian is so easy to read. Same for Artemis. It's just I don't get too much out of them. So, but at the same time, I sat next to a guy at the cinema, and I recommended to him to go and seek out Project Hail Mary and read it, because it will be easy. It will be easy to get invested in this. It will be easy to lose yourself in words and feel like you're not reading anything anymore. You're just experiencing, like, it's what the Germans would call Kopfkino. You know, it's just your eyes register the words, but what you're experiencing is theater of the mind. You know, and that's genuinely a mark of a great storyteller. Like Andy Weir is a great storyteller, just full stop. But he's also terrible at character writing. That's kind of how I see this. Like, you know, there's a problem because all of his books kind of look and sound the same, but at the end of the day, the experience of reading them is kind of fun. So I don't know what to do about it. Like, my prescription sort of at the end for this would be, like, I don't know. If you're about to read an Andy Weir book, just pick one and just start and stop at that. Or if you don't care, because if you feel like you can just get through this and just live your life without having to rant into a camera or write a 2,000 word essay about it, that's fine. But for me, this is kind of like where I have a problem, and maybe this is another caveat, because at the end of the day, what his books and movies these books spawn, they require me to suspend my disbelief, right? And I'm willing to suspend my disbelief once. I'm also willing to suspend my disbelief when I get something back. So, because they all look and sound and smell the same to me, it kind of becomes like I feel like I'm being tricked in here. But just in general, that's how I see these things are popular. And another thing, I think, just why this guy is popular, and actually this is how I cannot disagree, is, well, on top of being readable and satisfying, it's actually quite optimistic. And this is maybe something that speaks to the current era, because like the world outside is so terrible regardless, right? It's actually quite nice for a change to find I don't know, a story where everything just works out, you know, even though people, like, there's very little conflict, and just maybe this is, you know, like, I don't know, it speaks to the generation of people who, like, I don't know, like, are so somehow drawn to, like, manifesting aura farming or whatever, right? Where it's just, I don't know, good vibes. Again, like, you can't fault this guy for it, but in the absence of everything else, if you actually just go and break down his books, like, set them side by side, he's kind of like, I don't know, operates kind of sort of close to where Lee Child and Dan Brown and Michael Crichton is, but I would probably say, like, I prefer either of these three instead, you know? And if I have to say anything, I'll probably say, if you want to read a book by him, just read one. Any of them. I would probably say maybe choose between Project Hail Mary and The Martian. Like, Artemis is kind of slightly, I don't know, it's a bit different in terms of size and scope of what's happening. It's more of a conspiracy, sort of like a criminal murder story as well. So it's a little bit different, because they all kind of just like operate on the same level. Everything's solvable. Everything's easy to reduce to small steps. Complexity doesn't really push back. And actually, this is probably why his books are kind of so well received, because it's easy. And you don't have to, like, it's easy to get yourself invested. It's easy to get yourself lost in this. But, you know, at the end of the day, I don't know, maybe this is just me, but it all just feels a little bit hollow. So yeah, that's what I think about Andy Weir's writing. So if you disagree or agree with my takes, leave a comment below. Apologies for ranting for what feels like a while, and I'll catch you on the next one.